Nestled at the foot of Sai Sun Mountain, less than 30 kilometers from the center of Hanoi, lies a temple that has existed for nearly a millennium. Every year, millions of people come here to pray for peace, admire the picturesque scenery, and commemorate Zen Master Tu Dao Han, one of the most influential figures in the history of Vietnamese Buddhism. But very few people know that behind that serene facade lies a small room filled with human skeletons neatly arranged behind glass. Locals call that place the bone pit of Thay Pagoda. Where did these skeletons come from? Why weren't they buried in the usual way? Are they related to war, disease, or a particular religious ritual? Or is this just a legend passed down from generation to generation? In today's episode, we will trace historical documents, surviving records, and theories mentioned by many researchers to explore one of Vietnam's most mysterious locations.
If you enjoy unsolved mysteries, visit our channel for more fascinating videos. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications.
To understand the bone pit at Thay Pagoda, we must first go back nearly 1,000 years. Because the secret of this place doesn't begin with the skeletons. It begins with the pagoda itself. Located at the foot of Sai Sun Mountain, in Quoc Oai district, west of Hanoi, Thay Pagoda has long been considered one of Vietnam's oldest and most historically significant pagodas. According to many historical documents, the pagoda was built and developed during the Lai dynasty, a period when Buddhism held a crucial position in the political, cultural, and spiritual life of the nation. During that time, the Lai emperors not only patronized Buddhism but also built many large pagodas throughout the country. Thay Pagoda is one of the structures that still preserves many traces of that period. What makes Thay Pagoda unique is not just its age. It is also the name associated with Zen Master Tu Dao Han. Historical records portray him as a Zen master, a scholar, and a highly influential figure in Vietnamese Buddhism. In folklore, however, his image is far more mystical. There are stories of him healing the poor. Legends say he possessed magical powers. There are even anecdotes claiming he was reincarnated as a king of the Lai dynasty. Although these stories belong to beliefs and legends rather than verified history, they still demonstrate the profound influence of Tu Dao Han on Vietnamese culture. That is also why Thay Pagoda is not simply an architectural structure. For many, it is a space where history, religion, and faith coexist. But what attracts researchers' attention is not just the man. It is also the location of the pagoda. Viewed from above, Thay Pagoda is situated in a nearly perfect setting according to traditional feng shui principles. In front is Long Tri Lake with its calm, still waters. The two bridges, Not Tien Kio and Noyet Tien Kio, span the lake, connecting the everyday world with the spiritual space. Further away is Thuy Din, where traditional water puppetry was once performed during festivals. Behind the pagoda is Sai Sun Mountain, a limestone massif that has existed for millions of years. The combination of the lake, mountains, and forest creates a scene that is both peaceful and secluded. For ancient Zen masters, this was almost an ideal environment for meditation. Low noise. Minimal human interference. Close enough for people to come and learn about Buddhism, yet far enough to maintain the necessary tranquility for meditation. Perhaps that is why many generations of monks chose Sai Sun as their place of practice. But that very mountain also concealed a secret that only gradually came to light hundreds of years later. Standing at the foot of the mountain, it's difficult to imagine what lies behind those gray cliffs. Sai Sun is not a single mountain. It's a system of limestone mountains formed over millions of years by the action of water, wind, and the movement of the Earth's crust. Throughout this process, naturally acidic rainwater gradually dissolved the limestone, creating countless caves, fissures, and rock cavities. That's why many limestone mountains in Vietnam have hollow structures inside. Sai Sun is no exception. Hidden beneath the seemingly solid rock is a whole network of natural caves. Some caves are small. Some extend deep into the mountain. Some caves remain cool even in summer. Some caves receive almost no sunlight. For centuries, these caves have been used by humans in various ways. For the monks, it was a place for retreat and meditation. Living in the caves allowed them to detach themselves from the noise of daily life, dedicating their time entirely to spiritual practice. During periods of war or upheaval in the country, the caves also served as refuges for local people seeking shelter from bombs or temporary shelter. Therefore, each cave on Sai Sun Mountain may have witnessed many different periods of history. Interestingly, during numerous cleanings, repairs, and surveys, human remains were discovered in some of the caves. No documents indicate that all the remains appeared at the same time. It is likely that they were discovered over different periods. Instead of leaving the remains scattered in the caves, the temple and the people gathered them in a more solemn place. This is the storage area that is now known as the Bone Repository of Thay Pagoda. But it is from here that a series of new questions begin to emerge. Who were these people? Did they live hundreds or thousands of years ago? Were they monks who once meditated on the mountain? Were they local residents? Or were they anonymous individuals swept up in the events of history? To date, no comprehensive study has published a definitive answer. And perhaps, it is this very gap that makes the Bone Pit at Thay Pagoda one of Vietnam's most fascinating mysteries. In the next chapter, we will delve into the most debated part, the legends surrounding the Bone Pit and how they differ from what history and science currently record. In any culture, when a place exists longer than human memory, stories will gradually emerge. That doesn't mean those stories are entirely true. But they reflect how people try to explain things that history cannot answer. The Bone Pit at Thay Pagoda is a prime example. For generations, people around Sai Sun Mountain have passed down many different anecdotes. Some believe the skeletons belong to monks who once lived in seclusion in the cave. According to Buddhist tradition, going into seclusion in the mountains was once a fairly common practice. Zen masters lived in isolation for months, even years. Some spent most of their lives in quiet caves meditating and studying scriptures. From this, many people infer that if a monk died in the cave, his disciples may have buried or preserved his remains right where he practiced. This is the most frequently mentioned hypothesis. However, from a quantitative perspective, this hypothesis still leaves many questions unanswered. The number of skeletons preserved at the bone reservoir far exceeds the number of Buddhist monks recorded as having lived in the area. This leads many researchers to believe it's difficult to attribute all the remains to a single group. Another story suggests that the Sai Sun Mountain area was once a refuge for people during times of war. The history of northern Vietnam has seen many prolonged conflicts, from wars against foreign invaders to internal turmoil within dynasties. Mountainous areas with natural caves were often chosen as shelters. If someone died during that time, a proper burial was sometimes impossible. Over time, memories of those events faded, but the skeletons remained. That's just one hypothesis. There is currently no published archaeological evidence sufficient to definitively confirm that all the remains are related to any specific war. There are also stories with a supernatural element. Some visitors report feeling a strange atmosphere around the bone pit. Quieter. Heavier. Some say they heard strange noises coming from the mountains at night. These stories quickly spread, associating the place with many mystical elements. However, phenomena such as echoes in the caves, wind rustling through the crevices, or the stillness of the natural space can create very special experiences for people. Especially when we enter a place already steeped in mystery. Psychologists call this the expectation effect. When someone believes a place is mysterious, they are more likely to notice sounds, sights, or sensations that they might normally overlook. That doesn't mean their experience is fake. But it also doesn't mean it's evidence of a supernatural phenomenon. Perhaps the most interesting thing isn't whether the legends are true or false, but rather that they have become part of the local cultural history. Over generations, these stories have made the bone pit more than just a place to store remains. It has also become a repository of human memories and imagination. If legends are built from folk memory, then science begins with evidence. And it is at this point that the bone pit at Thay Pagoda becomes special. Because what science knows about this place is still quite limited. To date, there has been no comprehensive scientific publication determining the age of all the remains preserved at the bone pit. This means that we cannot conclude that they all belong to the same period. nor can we confirm that they all died from the same cause. For archaeologists, each set of remains is like a historical record. From the shape of the skull, bone structure, signs of healed fractures, injuries, or diseases, they can deduce a great deal of information about a person's life. For example, bones can indicate whether a person ever did heavy labor. Teeth can reflect their diet. Signs of joint degeneration can reveal age and living conditions. In some cases, carbon dating or DNA analysis can help determine age and kinship. However, such studies require proper preservation conditions, rigorous scientific procedures, and the collaboration of multiple disciplines. To date, no published results have fully answered all the questions surrounding the bone pit. Therefore, researchers often propose a more plausible possibility, that the current storage site may contain remains collected over many different periods. This also aligns with the fact that the Sai Sun Mountain area has been used by humans for centuries. If this is true, the bone pit does not reflect a single event. It is like a chronicle of bones, written from many different periods of history. Another noteworthy detail is the arrangement of the remains. If this were the result of a disaster or mass grave, one would typically expect signs of emergency burial or mixing. In contrast, the current storage area shows that the remains were intentionally gathered and preserved. This reflects a very different attitude. It's not neglect. It's preservation. In Vietnamese culture, caring for unclaimed remains has long been considered an act of humanistic and spiritual significance. This may also explain why these remains were not left in caves, but brought to a more dignified location. Perhaps the greatest value of the bone repository at Thay Pagoda lies not in how many secrets we have deciphered, but in the fact that it reminds us that history is not always complete. There are stories that have been recorded in books. But there are also stories that are left with only a few silent bones, waiting for people of the 21st century to continue searching for answers.
If you enjoyed the story of Miyamoto Musashi, please visit our channel for more fascinating videos about other mysterious stories.
After learning about the existence of the bone pit, most people ask the same question. If so many remains were discovered, why weren't they all reburied? Why are they still kept within the grounds of a temple? To answer that question, we first need to understand how Vietnamese people view the deceased. In Vietnamese culture, death is not the end. The connection between the living and the deceased continues through worship, remembrance, and grave care. Therefore, when unidentified remains are discovered or their relatives cannot be found, gathering them at a temple is often seen as a way for them to find their final resting place. This is not unique to Thay Pagoda. In many localities in Vietnam, unmarked graves, after being cleared, discovered by natural disasters, or accidentally found, are often moved to communal cemeteries or temple grounds for care and offerings. In Buddhism, every human being deserves to be treated with compassion, regardless of who they were in life. Therefore, preserving unmarked remains is not intended to create a sense of horror. It reflects a humane approach to the past. Upon entering the bone repository, the first thing one notices is not an arrangement designed to frighten. The remains are carefully collected and placed in a solemn space. This shows that the main purpose is preservation and remembrance. From another perspective, not reburying the remains also helps prevent further loss if their origin remains unclear. Thus, they are preserved as a part of local history. Perhaps the most memorable thing about leaving the bone pit wasn't the number of remains. It was the feeling that, even though their names have faded with time, there are still people who choose to preserve their memories. When it comes to places that preserve human remains, many people immediately think of catacombs in Europe. But in reality, the collection of human remains is not uncommon throughout human history. In many different cultures, people have faced the same question: what to do with the deceased when cemeteries are full, or when remains are discovered after centuries. In Europe, there are famous structures where remains are preserved as part of history and belief. In some places, skulls and bones are arranged into decorative panels. In other places, millions of skeletons lie in underground tunnels. The original purpose of these sites was not to inspire fear. They were created to preserve remains and remind people of the finiteness of life. If we place the bone repository at Thay Pagoda in that context, we will see a similarity. It's not a place for telling ghost stories. It's a place where the memories of anonymous people are preserved. The difference lies in the approach. European ossuaries often become popular tourist attractions. Meanwhile, the bone repository at Thay Pagoda maintains a very tranquil atmosphere. There are no colorful lights. No effects to create a spooky feeling. No officially presented stories to stimulate curiosity. The pagoda still considers it primarily a space for remembrance. This difference gives the bone repository a unique character. It doesn't try to impress. But it leaves people thinking long after they leave. Strangely, after nearly 1,000 years, Thay Pagoda still attracts many people. They come for the architecture. For the festivals. For the scenery. But very few people take the time to contemplate the bone pit. Perhaps because those skeletons don't tell a story in words. They simply exist silently. Each skeleton was once a human being. Perhaps they were a monk who spent their entire life in a cave. Perhaps they were an ordinary person. Or they may belong to different periods that history has yet to piece together into a complete story. What makes this place special isn't that we know everything. On the contrary. It's precisely that we don't know. History always has gaps. These gaps don't only exist in Vietnam. They appear in every civilization. Sometimes, a line of text in history disappears. Sometimes, an entire life is reduced to a few bones. But that doesn't mean they never existed. Perhaps the bone pit at Thay Pagoda is reminding us of something very simple. That history isn't only preserved in books, stone tablets, or temples. Sometimes, history lies within the anonymous people whose names no one remembers. We may never know exactly who they were. But their presence still helps us understand the past, the culture of remembrance, and how people treat the deceased. And perhaps, that is the greatest secret of the bone pit at Thay Pagoda. Not a curse. Not a supernatural phenomenon. But the ability of this small place at the foot of Sai Sun Mountain to make us reflect on time, memory, and the value of each life. Strangely, after nearly 1,000 years, Thay Pagoda still attracts many people. They come for the architecture. For the festivals. For the scenery. But very few people take the time to contemplate the bone pit. Perhaps because those skeletons don't tell a story in words. They simply exist silently. Each skeleton was once a human being. Perhaps they were a monk who spent their entire life in a cave. Perhaps they were an ordinary person. Or they may belong to different periods that history has yet to piece together into a complete story. What makes this place special isn't that we know everything. On the contrary. It's precisely that we don't know. History always has gaps. These gaps don't only exist in Vietnam. They appear in every civilization. Sometimes, a line of text in history disappears. Sometimes, an entire life is reduced to a few bones. But that doesn't mean they never existed. Perhaps the bone pit at Thay Pagoda is reminding us of something very simple. That history isn't only preserved in books, stone tablets, or temples. Sometimes, history lies within the anonymous people whose names no one remembers. We may never know exactly who they were. But their presence still helps us understand the past, the culture of remembrance, and how people treat the deceased. And perhaps, that is the greatest secret of the bone pit at Thay Pagoda. Not a curse. Not a supernatural phenomenon. But the ability of this small place at the foot of Sai Sun Mountain to make us reflect on time, memory, and the value of each life.